I have to tell you, being in Washington and traveling around the country and talking about elections and politics and governance, it helps to be from Florida, since Florida seems to be the scene of so many interesting and controversial developments in our politics. It was especially helpful for being from Palm Beach County in 2000. You all remember, those of you who are too young to remember, you've certainly read about the rather dramatic and controversial and passionate developments after Election Day, November 2000, in that presidential race. And it was my own county of Palm Beach that made the greatest contribution to the election that year and creating the butterfly ballot. You all remember the butterfly ballot, actually created by the Democratic election official in charge of this, which of course led to great confusion and alas, probably accounted for, as many other things could have, Al Gore's failure to get to the White House. But I keep telling people, listen, the butterfly ballot wasn't all that bad. For example, it helped us detect one of the new and emerging political groups in America, Jews for Pat Buchanan. You remember that. I'll explain that to the rest of you later. Well, it's an exciting time in politics. A lot of changes underway. In fact, I was discussing those dramatic changes with my cab driver on the way out to the airport yesterday afternoon, Karl Rove, if you remember him. I know my task here is to try to make sense of these elections and of politics in America more broadly. Whenever given that charge, I'm reminded of a story that Mark Russell, the political comedian, tells on himself. I don't know if you all know Mark Russell, but he started out decades ago in Washington at the Shoreham Hotel trying out his latest political jokes on Tip O'Neill and Bob Dole and other political notables. He was getting rave reviews and having a wonderful time, but over a period of years, he decided he was ready for the big time. So he moved to Buffalo, New York, and started his show there. Before long, it was picked up by the public broadcast service, PBS, and televised all over the country, even to Minot, North Dakota. Well, as luck would have it, he was introduced to a woman from Minot and said to her very excitedly, "Is it true? Is it true? Do you get my show in Minot?" Well, she thought for a moment, smiled wryly, and said, "We see it, but we don't get it." I have a feeling that's how a lot of people feel about Washington, about American politics, and about these elections. So my job is to see if together we can't get it. We can't figure out what is afoot, what is at stake, and what might happen over the course of the next year. I say the next year, and you probably get a little weary since you thought the campaign has already been on for a year, and indeed it has, but that's just one of the many interesting new features of our electoral process. I have to begin on a somewhat somber note, namely the toxic public mood that really characterizes politics in America today. I've seldom seen an electorate as down on public life and the direction of the country as I've seen in recent months. If you ask Americans, do you believe the country's moving in the right direction, or are we seriously off track? 71% off track. The numbers believing we're doing okay are way down in the 1920s. We have a deeply unpopular president whose approval ratings have been around 30% for an extended period of time. We've certainly had presidents with lower ratings, but usually for a relatively brief period of time, George W. Bush may well break the record for the lowest sustained ratings of any president since the advent of political polling. But the Congress is doing its best to match him or beat him. The ratings of Congress are exceedingly low. There was a burst of excitement after the 2006 midterm elections. The new Democratic majority, the first female Speaker of the House, the sense of possibility and change. But over the intervening months, Americans have returned to a very negative assessment of Congress as well. There's no surprise in many ways. Part of this is a reflection of a very, very unpopular war in Iraq that has led over 60% of Americans to conclude that it was a mistake to enter in the first place, that the costs outweigh the benefits, and that they desperately want to see American military forces withdrawn by next year, before the end of the Bush presidency. It's also a period of economic insecurity. While we've had certainly economic growth that has been impressive in a situation in which there's been extended global economic growth, Americans are insecure and pessimistic about the economy. It's partly changes in the structure of a global economy in which there's much less certainty about pensions, about access to affordable health care, about the availability of well-paying and predictable and stable jobs. We've also been through a period of years in which there's been no real wage gains for most Americans at a time of very high energy prices and healthcare cost inflation, escalating tuitions at institutions of higher education, and the rest. We've also, of course, seen a string of scandals in Congress, in the executive, and examples of incompetence by government following Katrina, certainly in Iraq, in the contracting world that has added to this kind of gloom and doom sentiment. But perhaps one thing that has come to bother the public as much as anything else is the ideological polarization of the political parties. This has been a long time in coming. Most of you here weren't around and attuned to our politics before this pattern took hold, which was really in the early 1980s, following dramatic changes in our politics in the 60s and 70s. But there used to be a lot of diversity within each political party. There was a center of gravity for the Democrats a bit on the left and the Republicans a bit on the right, but there were conservative Democrats and there were moderate Republicans. Lou Frey, in whose name this institute certainly was you could say, a good Republican, a conservative, but he was a pragmatic, operational Republican in Congress who did work of significance on his committees and on the floor. He was in Congress when it was possible to do business across the aisle. Nowadays, that's almost never to be seen. We've pulled apart into partisan camps whose ideological poles are very distant, and it makes it exceedingly difficult to get anything done. And so much of what happens is a consequence of a permanent campaign being waged every day from the White House, from majority and minority leaders in Congress. Everyone is looking to get the rhetorical advantage, to frame the issue in a way that will advantage their political party. It's especially intense because the parties have been operating at a rough parity. Very narrow elections for the House and the Senate and for the presidency, and we now see that across the country in terms of numbers of governorships and state legislatures controlled by each of the political parties. So that's the public mood and what broadly accounts for it. We now are in a situation with a lame duck president, about 15 months left in his presidency, who has decided, unlike Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton in a different time but a similar position, to basically reinforce his base, to look for fights with a Democratic Congress. We're now engaged in a series of budgetary fights. The total difference between the Democratic Congress budget plan and the administration's is $22 billion out of about $700 billion of discretionary spending. That's not trivial money, but in terms of broad fiscal policy, it's a rounding error. We get re-estimates of the cost of the war in Iraq coming forward every several months that are multiples of that total difference. In fact, 2/3 of the difference in spending is designed to account for the cost of inflation on certain high-priority programs for Democrats over this period of time. If the object was to just work out an agreement, they could sit down and half a day work it out, and the appropriations bills, which have not moved, we finally have had one signed into law well after the beginning of the fiscal year, could be resolved. But this is a time for another symbolic fight. So many of the fights and battles in Washington are symbolic, and the president has decided he's going to stick with his guns. He's, after 6 years of very high spending and tax cutting, he's decided to sort of stick with the tax cutting, but try to begin to put some pressure on parts of the spending. But because of the enormous cost of military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the overall level and the driving cost of our social insurance programs, which added to was the prescription drug bill that the president was successful in passing in his first term. So that's what America sees is fighting and rhetorical excesses, and gets a sense that we don't have serious people in Washington tending to the country's business. We have a frustrated Democratic majority in Congress that has its own agenda and believes they were mandated by the electorate in 2006 to change the course of the war in Iraq. Well, the course of the war in Iraq changed. We had the surge and an addition of 30,000 additional troops. Not quite what the electorate had in mind in 2006, but it shows you the power and ability of a president intent on pursuing a particular course of the war to have his way, even though we have a system of separated powers, and Congress presumably with the control of the purse as well as various war-making and legislating powers to be able to affect that. But the reality is, with narrow majorities, with a Senate with the threat of filibusters that cannot act without supermajorities of 60 votes and presidential vetoes, it becomes it becomes very difficult. So Democrats, while having some success with their middle-level domestic agenda items, have been deeply frustrated by their inability to change policy in Iraq and frustrated by this engagement on the budget at the margins, which the president will win because the Congress won't be willing to shut down government in an absolute showdown, intelligence oversight, and the rest. And so many Democratic activists are now dumping on their Democratic leaders in the Democratic Party, which accounts for the even lower ratings of the Congress. Republicans are against them because they are Democrats and in control of the Congress, and a lot of Democrats are against them because they haven't stopped the war. Now, the other piece of this broad political environment is that we've been in this red-blue 50-50 nation for some time. Amazing level of parity between the parties, even though in many respects it's the conservatives and the Republicans that have dominated our politics since the election of Ronald Reagan. But we are now in a situation, and we don't know how stable this will be or whether the trend will continue, in which we've moved off this 50-50 balance to a clear and distinct Democratic advantage. 4 or 5 years ago, there were roughly equal numbers of citizens who identified as Democrats and Republicans. Now Democrats have opened a 15-point lead on that. It's more like 50-35. If you ask the public which party is best able to handle the most serious problems that confront the country, it's the Democrats, usually by 10 or 15 or 20 percentage points. Even on national security now, which has long been the strong point of the Republican Party, Democrats now have the edge, and the parties are even on who can best deal with the problems of terrorism. If you ask voters who they'd like to see control the Congress, the Republicans or the Democrats, and then after the next election, there's a 10 to 15 percentage point advantage, the Democrats. If you ask whether they'd like to see a Democratic or Republican president again, by a 10 to 15 point advantage, it's Democratic. Of course, when you actually pair real candidates, the race for the presidency, although not the Congress, is much closer. If only Democrats could run an anonymous candidate for president in 2008, I'm convinced they'd sweep to victory. So maybe whoever wins the nomination will have a hood and wear it throughout the campaign, and it'll just say Democratic candidate, and that will take care of it. If you look at the sort of changes in the coalitional bases of the parties, at young voters, at Hispanics, changes now among well-educated married women, you're beginning to see Democratic pickups that suggest that in the areas of growth of the electorate, it's the Democrats that are picking up the most headway. There's long, by the way, been a divide between married and unmarried voters, that married voters are much more likely to be and vote Republican, unmarried Democratic. That still persists, but what we're beginning to see is this shift. It's partly a kind of a new professional class, well-educated, that is uncomfortable with the moral traditionalism pillar of the Republican Party, but also has been very discouraged by the last 6 years of Iraq. And finally, if you begin looking at individual states, you see the map, the electoral map changing. Florida remains very much a purple state, very much up for grabs, although Republicans have have done well in recent elections. I think it's very much on the table, but the changes afoot in, say, Virginia, my neighboring state, of Colorado, of New Mexico. We're seeing it now in Arizona, Nevada, and especially notable in the last couple of years have been Ohio, New Hampshire, and Iowa, all of which had really been voting Republican, and now in elections for statewide office, for Congress, the House, and the Senate, and suggesting those states ripe for Democratic takeover. So that's the broad political environment in which we begin to take a look at the 2008 election. Let me say first a bit about the structure of the presidential nominating system. First thing to be said is we're not used to having an election in which there's no incumbent president or vice president running. We haven't had one since 1928. That's really unusual. That means you have wide open contest in both parties. Typically it only happens in one party, and that accounts for many of the new developments that we see this time around. Secondly, we have this extraordinary schedule. It's both deeply front-loaded, but it's also uncertain. And you're partly to blame. The state of Florida, trying to get more attention, trying to have more influence, not willing to sit back with California and New York and Illinois and other states on the mega Tuesday of February 5th, but we're going to move ahead contrary to the written policies of their respective Republican and Democratic parties and schedule this primary a week before. Of course, that led other states to say, ooh, South Carolina was already on the Democratic side permitted to go earlier, but the Republicans decided to move up really early, which made New Hampshire uneasy, and Iowa started thinking, oh my God, we might not be the first event in the schedule. So it wasn't that long ago that they were late in January with New Hampshire coming late in February. Now we're going to have the Iowa caucuses on January 3rd, right after the holiday season, and New Hampshire's likely to come on the 9th. And then we have uncertainty because of the states of Michigan and Florida, and whether, by the way, there's no way they're going to win that court battle, just for the record, that the Democrats have filed. And so if Florida decides to stick with it, they're going to have to take a risk that they will get their delegates seated by action of the winning candidate urging the convention to seat them. But it's a risky thing because Democrats, fearful of backlash in the earliest states, have pledged to stay out of the state, and that denies you much of what you had in mind in terms of being influential. But anyways, all of this has moved up much closer. We have 20 primaries producing a huge number of delegates on February 5th, but making the earliest events even more important. As a consequence, the candidates, except for Fred Thompson, who plans his own life according to matters that are indecipherable to many of the rest of us, announced early and have been running hard since the beginning of this year. We've seen an extraordinary amount of fundraising. The amounts are historic. We have seen most of the major candidates reject the public financing matching grants because they come with spending limits. And certainly Clinton Obama on the Democratic side, and Giuliani and Romney on the Republican side believe that, and have demonstrated already, they can raise substantially more money than is permitted by this system. And the fear of one doing it and the other not has led to a kind of arms race in fundraising. The interesting development here, there are two candidates who now feel obliged to accept the public funding. One is John Edwards, who is certainly among the top three Democratic candidates, but whose fundraising, while impressive compared to all previous candidates, is way behind Clinton and Obama. And his only hope is to break through in Iowa, and he's decided he's going to take the public funding, and he's going to spend the money, even though there's a statewide limit. There are gimmicks for getting around that to spend maybe instead of $3 up to $5 million, but Clinton and Obama will each pour at least $15 million into the Iowa caucuses. Will be maybe 120,000 participants in those. It's really quite amazing. The other thing that's happened is we've seen disparity in fundraising between the parties. One indicator of the extent to which Democrats are enthused and Republicans discouraged is the fundraising. Democrats are doing much better in raising money at all levels for the presidency, for the House, and for the Senate than are the Republicans. Two other points I'd make about the structure of the nominating system, and that's sort of policy differences, issues. And here's my advice to you in looking at the campaign. Issue differences are not a basis on which to differentiate among Democrats or among Republicans. There is relatively little difference, except for the outliers like Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich. There's relatively little difference among the major Democratic candidates, and similarly, relatively little difference among the major Republican candidates. Yet, the gulf between that center of gravity in the Democratic field and center of gravity in the Republican field is deep and wide. It is two worlds. It is Mars and Venus. It provides as clear a sense of the importance and the meaning of political parties as anything in our politics today. Therefore, the choices of candidates will have much less to do with particular positions taken on issues as it will by their other qualities, electability, perception of being able to govern effectively, inspirational qualities, character, you name it. Final point, an early resolution of both nominations is possible, in fact likely in this system, but it's by no means guaranteed. If it happens, if after the results of February 5th are in, because the early results have been decisive and set up February 5th, then the general election will begin on February 6th. Are you ready for that? February 6th to November 6th, or something like that. A very long general election. Okay, a couple of words about the Republican and Democratic contest, and then something about the general election. On the Republican side, a relatively weak field as defined by Republican rank-and-file voters. None of the candidates fits the mold of most Republicans who have won the nomination in recent years. That is singled out early on, as George W. Bush was in 1980, as the likely candidate. His time has come. He deserves it. He represents our party well. there was Bob Dole, there was Ronald Reagan, indeed Richard Nixon. Instead, you have candidates, each of whom has strengths and each of whom has weaknesses within the Republican Party. None has yet been able to unite party factions. It's one of the reasons why there seemed to be an opening for Fred Thompson. It's one of the reasons why the little-known former Republican governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, best known for his writings and his example on obesity and the loss thereof, has generated such excitement in recent weeks. Rudy Giuliani has maintained a stable but modest lead in the national polls for much of the year. In fact, he thought he was doing even better. You know, his vote has been roughly 30% or less for a long period of time, but he got a report that he was up to 50%. Unfortunately, his staffers hadn't told him that was only within his own family, but that's another story. Rudy's an unlikely candidate based on his interesting personal life, is the ethical problems of his dearest colleagues and associates, and his positions on social issues. But he has more than made up for this with an image of toughness and strength on dealing with the enemy, which is now the jihadist, and that has served him well. He's also made a very good living since leaving the mayoralty. Part of it is Giuliani's law firm, his consulting firm, but where he's really made bucks is as an inspirational speaker. He's a terrific speaker. Mitt Romney looks like he's out of central casting as president. He's tall, he's handsome, he's articulate, he's intelligent, he's a successful businessman. He saved the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. He managed to get elected governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and emerge from it alive. But alas, he's been a sort of born-again conservative. He had drifted to the left, in dealing with the Massachusetts constituency. He's now come back with a sort of vigor more to the right, even to the point of occasionally disclaiming his biggest legislative success in Massachusetts, his health reform, which was an impressive piece of work. But Romney has by far the best organized campaign. He has the clearest strategy for winning, namely investing early in Iowa and New Hampshire and riding victories there to national recognition and success. John McCain began as the front runner and acted like one, at which point his candidacy collapsed. McCain is only attractive when he's a maverick, when he's not a front runner, when he's not sucking up to core constituencies within the party, and yet that's what he came to do. He raised a lot of money and spent even more to no end, and seemed to be on the verge of dropping out, but he's come back. He's trying hard. Probably going to take public financing, and again, that's a sign of weakness, not of strength. He's nowhere in Iowa, but he's hoping he can come back from a large deficit in New Hampshire to re-spark his candidacy. One of the downsides is that John McCain is the uber hawk in the campaign, the one who believes there is no alternative but victory in Iraq, whatever the cost that have to be paid. Critic of how the war was waged, but never challenging the basis of it. That makes him vulnerable in a general election, but even on the Republican side, there are about 40% of Republicans who are really disheartened by the war and want it over. Enough. We've done it. We've done our best and we've done our part. So, as for Fred Thompson, I know him from when he was in the Senate. I had occasion to speak with him. Urged him to get in the race because I thought there was real vacuum in the field. He took so long deciding that by the time he announced, people had got tired of the story of whether he was running, but more importantly, he didn't have a stump speech, so he didn't have a clear message for his candidacy when he was finally public. So the stories talked about the disarray in the campaign, the sort of failure to recruit and keep a stable staff, and it's a little unclear whether that initial surge and decline will now lead to his collapse once the early events are over. And as I say, the real surprise is Mike Huckabee. I said 2 years ago he'll be the most interesting of the Republican candidates. The real question is whether he'll be serious or whether he's just running for vice president. He never put together a fundraising operation. He's raised almost no money. And the fact is, given this compressed schedule, you can't depend on just surprising in Iowa and then the money flooding in. You need to have more to take advantage of it. So he's around, he has great potential, but he has virtually no money, and it will be very difficult. Even if he were to pull an upset of Romney in Iowa to ride that to victory. So you can see how unsettled it is. I can come up with 4 or 5 scenarios that would produce different candidates. Right now, I think the odds slightly favor the Romney sort of strategy and route to the nomination, but I would not bet my retirement fund, however shaky it may be, on the outcome of that race. They're surprised to be seen, but it would be foolish to imagine that Giuliani has this wrapped up. This is very much open. Democratic contest is different. The rank-and-file Democrats love their candidates. There's really a big distinction in their level of enthusiasm for the candidates. Virtually all Democrats could live with Clinton, Obama, or Edwards. They all have very high favorability ratings. John Edwards, if he loses, may not vote for Hillary Clinton, but John Edwards supporters would vote for Hillary Clinton. It's seen as a strong field, and even the second-tier candidates that have all of the long resumes, the most experience, Bill Richardson, Joe Biden, and Chris Dodd, on sort of paper are very qualified individuals, but if you look at events, you will really see a difference, and the ability of the first 3 to reach out and connect with the Times, with the electorate, with the voters, and the second 3 not to. So I think as soon as Iowa comes, the second tier will be gone, and we will then see what kind of a race we will have. Hillary Clinton is the closest to an incumbent vice president because of her time in the White House and visibility and standing and support in the party. But there remains an anxiety among some Democrats. They see her as a very strong candidate, but they also know that there are images of her held by Republicans and independents that go back many years and don't reflect the kind of senator she's become or the kind of campaign she's waging. Listen, this was never a setup. Leads in national polls don't mean anything if they're not reinforced by leads in the early events, because an early event can quickly change the national poll standing. Ask John Kerry and ask many other candidates who face this situation. Obama is sort of a phenom. no one quite knows what to make of it. How can someone who was just a state senator a few years ago be a leading candidate for the presidency? Well, stranger things have happened in our history with people coming into the White House. I think he gained credibility by his fantastic fundraising record during this year, and while many have been disappointed by his failure to break out of the position he's in and challenge Clinton in the national polls, the reality is he's well organized and spending heavily in Iowa, and an Iowa victory would create a genuinely competitive contest between Ohio victory by Obama would turn this into a Clinton versus Obama race, and while Clinton certainly has the lead now in New Hampshire and South Carolina and Florida and many of the February 5th states, that could easily change if he closes and overtakes her there. That's why these 8 weeks are very important. Edwards is a brilliant speaker. It's hard to find someone as effective as him on the stump, but he's going for broke and running a much more populist campaign, more left than seems natural for him, and certainly harsher in his criticism of Clinton and increasingly Obama. It's my sense is that it won't work, and that the odds are he's going to be third man out in Iowa and have to fold him then. But again, he's competitive right now, and the next weeks will make a real difference. So, and as I say, Richardson is spent in Iowa. He's fourth, but the odds of him or Biden or Dodd breaking through early are very small. We're going to be down to 2 or 3 candidates after Iowa. If Clinton wins big in Iowa, it will be exceedingly difficult to stop her. If Obama wins, it will be a two-person contest that will certainly go on to February 5th, and if that isn't decisive, we could get a longer race and uncertainty for an extended period of time. Final couple of points. Forgive me for going on so long, but I'm having fun, you know. The general election. What are the issues that are going to drive this election? First of all, I think it's important to say that while foreign policy oftentimes gets marginalized in a presidential campaign, it will not get marginalized this time. The stakes are too high. Our footprint in Iraq is too deep. The talk about Iran and its movement towards building nuclear weapons and the loose talk about intervening militarily have raised the stakes. There is concern and a big debate about how to deal with terrorism, whether the whole notion of a war on terrorism makes any sense, because it's a war that may never end. Terrorism is a tactic, and that will be important. And now we have Pakistan on the verge of collapse, with a huge number of nuclear weapons and a significant radical sort of Muslim community, not one large enough to win an election, but one large enough to wreak havoc in that country. And we have a global economy under some stress now that is going to elevate the economic dimension of foreign policy to the fore. It's possible that by promising a gradual reduction of military forces in Iraq, as the administration did with General Petraeus in September, and then making a subsequent announcement in March of building down beyond the surge troops, say to 100,000 by election time, that will take some of the edge off Iraq. But Iraq has been factored into the public mood and the public unhappiness with the president, and so it's not going away. Secondly, the economy, both economic insecurity, that's been part of the American experience and psyche, but now increasingly macroeconomic concerns with the credit crisis, with the price of energy, with a falling dollar. There really is a possibility of a recession next year, which will magnify many of the problems we have. In terms of a specific issue within the broad set of economic concerns, health reform will be at the top. Americans are really anxious about maintaining or achieving access to affordable health care. We are an outlier in the world of democracies. We spend much more money than any other democracy on health care, and yet we're the only ones that don't have universal health care insurance coverage in this country, and some of our health indicators are lower than many of our sister countries. There are problems. There are now groups of businesses, of states and localities, of nonprofit groups that have begun to say, hey, we got to deal with this problem. And many of the medical providers, which oftentimes opposed federal action in this area, are becoming its greatest champions. So this will be an issue of enormous importance. Finally, competence and corruption will be central as well. I end with this set of questions in the general election. Are we nearing the end of a conservative movement built around tax cuts, moral traditionalism, and aggressive nationalism? These three pillars have dominated and defined our politics for a long time, but there is the sense that they may well have run out their string, that they don't seem to address the central challenges and concerns facing America. And it'll be fascinating to see in the war of ideas and ideologies whether it begins to lose its steam. Next question, will the Republican nominee be able to break with President Bush enough to be competitive in the general election without demoralizing the Republican base? Right now, all of the major Republican candidates are running as loyal successors to a deeply unpopular president. They can't maintain that posture and have any chance of winning. But when do they break and how do they break? We're going to have to keep an eye on that. Is Hillary Clinton electable? Big debate about whether she has such a high floor but very low ceiling that, and as a polarizing candidate, be impossible to elect. The evidence pulled together by Gallup, by Pew, by others suggests that she may have a low ceiling, but it's probably 53% of the electorate, which maybe 54, which would, if the broad political environment remains very negative for the Republicans, produce an electoral college landslide. So she can win, but it's not clear that she would be the strongest candidate. Right now, Democrats believe she would, but there is the question, then would Obama be a stronger candidate? He's vulnerable on grounds of experience. He would be the first African-American candidate. On the other hand, he's sort of inspirational. He promises the quickest route to healing our wounds internationally, of giving America a look very different from the one it's had in the last 6 years. But that's a question. What could derail a likely Democratic victory in the presidential election? An attack on Iran? Another terrorist strike here at home? Anything could shake it up, but it's not obvious that either would work to the advantage of the incumbent administration. What's clear is that the Democrats will likely pick up seats in both the House and the Senate. The best odds are that we will have a new unified democratic government, but it's one that will still have narrow majorities, well short of filibuster proof in the Senate. It's one in which they would be committed to grapple with energy and healthcare and fiscal policy and national security that simply can't be done with Democrats alone. It would require transformation in the way a president tries to broaden the coalition, to work well away from his political base. Will the next occupant of the White House, if a Democrat, approach governance in that fashion? Will the Democratic leadership and Congress loosen the process and begin to include Republicans to try to grapple with some of these problems? These are all mysteries, but the stakes are high for the country and the world, and therefore it merits our continuing attention and involvement.
You brought up the issue of possible recession by next summer.
Yeah.
Would that create an environment in which Mike Bloomberg could decide that he's going to enter the race as a third-party candidate, and considering his financial background, be able to present himself to voters as somebody who could grapple with the social and economic issues we face?
It's possible. Many of us have been ruminating about the potential independent, not third-party candidacy of Michael Bloomberg. A lot of us just like him. He's a very sensible man who's been, I must say, a very successful mayor of New York, and if you believe him and his aides, a hell of a lot more successful than Rudy Giuliani. Certainly he hasn't been the polarizing figure that Giuliani was, which was leaving him as a very unpopular, outgoing mayor when 9/11 happened, and his image was transformed. Michael Bloomberg could write a check for $1 billion to finance his campaign without noticing it. That's a rounding error for him, and it certainly simplifies matters. It makes it much easier to launch a candidacy late. The question is, what would be the market? We know that even though the country has sorted itself into one party or the other based on ideology, that is, the conservative Dems have gone to the Republicans, the liberal and moderate Republicans have gone to the Dems. They now feel very strongly about their parties. At the same time, they don't like the partisan bickering and the deadlocks that develop as a consequence of it, so that if the nominees are identified as being close to their ideological bases and still speaking in those terms, it would create an opening and opportunity. But my guess is that won't happen. I mean, both Obama and Clinton have started the general election rhetoric of bringing the country together, of reaching out across the aisle, of looking to reframe issues in ways that can attract much broader support, of building on the success of some states and cities where a more pragmatic form of governance has happened. If the candidates do that, that reduces the opportunity and opening for Bloomberg, certainly. The question is then, but what about a recession? Would that create some new opportunities? One of the advantages Democrats have is that during the Clinton years, eventually they emerge with a reputation for competence in economic management broadly and fiscal policy in particular. So Democrats as a party now have quite a bit of credibility on that score. So I'm guessing a recession would be more likely to increase the probability of strong Democratic showing rather than create an opening for Bloomberg. Bloomberg will run if he thinks he can win. He won't otherwise. He's not going to waste his time or his reputation on a quixotic run or trying to influence the outcome. Ross Perot may have had a crazy aunt in the attic and been a little crazy himself, but but Michael Bloomberg is cold, sober, steady, and will make a rational calculation here. I sort of see it as maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 5 that conditions will look promising enough. Right now it looks as if he's caught with strong partisan feelings, and especially among Democrats, and still a loyal block of Republicans. He kind of sees his ceiling at 20, maybe 25%. It wouldn't be enough to win electoral votes, and therefore he wouldn't be a factor.
You stated that public financing is seen as a sign of weakness. My question is, may I ask why it is seen as a sign of weakness when a candidate takes the public financing money?
Isn't that very sad? It's extremely sad, but what it does is it reflects their willingness to operate at a great disadvantage. That is, to have to live with unrealistically low spending limits for individual states and for the whole nomination contest. Those levels have not been properly adjusted over time. The program is wildly out of date. It desperately needs to be changed to make the matching grants more generous, to raise the spending limits, to remove the limits on individual states. Some members of Congress have worked hard to do that, but they haven't been able to succeed yet. George Bush was, in 2000, the first successful candidate to forego public funding and finance on his own. In 2004, the Democrats felt they had to do it. So you had Howard Dean and John Kerry both do it, and this time around, the assumption was, well, the other side's going to do it. If we want to be competitive, we have to do it. So sadly, it's a practical reason why it's a sign of weakness, but in terms of the public good, we'd be a hell of a lot better off if we revived and renewed that program and got all of our candidates the incentive to participate in it.
Given the public perception of the current administration, how do you think that a Republican candidate might act during the general election to kind of offset that perception?
Well, that's one of the dilemmas I posed to you. How quickly can they turn? And how valuable are the nuggets, the pillars of the Republican public philosophy that have carried the party over the last couple of decades? That is, cutting taxes is always a good thing. We've got to take the fight to the enemy and act aggressively internationally, even if we have to act on our own, and we have to preserve and protect moral traditionalism in this country. The difficulties are that on the foreign policy arena, the change, that strategy has run into great setbacks around, and people are deeply skeptical about the efficacy of that national security policy. America's becoming more socially tolerant. Sea change in public attitudes towards same-sex relations. Abortion is pretty much where it's always been. Most Americans find it morally repugnant, but they want to retain a legal option for it. They don't want to criminalize it, but they would support efforts to discourage the number of abortions that take place by providing other programs and opportunities. And on tax cuts, yeah, everybody likes to have their taxes cut, but you're beginning to see around a belief that, gee, if we keep cutting taxes, everything will get better, is sort of being questioned. It doesn't link up with what we know we face in the years ahead, and so that makes it all the more difficult to have a transition. I think in substantive terms it won't be great. I can't imagine Republicans reversing course on Iraq. What they'll try to say is the president, hoping that the recent news on the decline of violence in Iraq will be sustained for a period of time. That's a big if. It's a big if. There are a number of reasons why we've seen some decline, and there are a number of reasons to question whether that can be sustained. But the hope is to say we see the light at the end of the tunnel, we're moving out, but we want to do it in a responsible way so as not to have more damage, and hope that will be credible. But I look across the range of issues, and I frankly don't see much opportunity. So my own view is given the adverse political environment, given the adverse issue agenda, what the Republican candidate will probably do is try to turn it into a choice of individuals, contrasting qualities of the individual candidates, which means raising serious doubts about the Democratic nominee and emphasizing the sort of personal strengths and features. If it's McCain, it's character and courage and honesty. If it's Romney, it's business acumen and the ability to actually make things work. If it's Rudy, it's I'll kick ass. And beyond that, I don't know what to suggest. But I think all of that suggests that's how they'll try to distinguish themselves from George Bush, not in substantive policy issue terms, but in personal terms. I would have done it much better, and I will do it much better than him.
Do you see that there will be an end to the partisan struggle in Congress that's kept them basically at a standstill?
Certainly not this Congress. The only way it could happen is if there were participants at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue that saw an interest in doing it, as there was in Reagan's last 2 years in office, as there was for Bill Clinton, especially in 1996 and 97. But right now, the president has decided he wants to define differences rather than negotiate agreements that would allow some Republicans to come in to the negotiations. So if you look to see what's happened on the state CHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program, on the budget battles, on a host of other matters, it looks as if he's digging in his feet for a fight. Under those circumstances, the partisan conflict between Democrats and the Republicans is likely to continue and to intensify. The only change is likely to occur after the 2009 elections, and that would require an approach from the White House that is very accommodating to the minority party. When you have a war of the roses between two parties, it's the one in charge that has to make the first moves. And right now, Democrats feel when they make those moves, they get burned. More in the Senate with the filibusters than in the House, but that means the first move is going to have to come from a president. If I'm wrong and the election changes and we get a Republican president, either with a shocking reversal and a Republican Congress, or if we get a sort of divided party government, it will require that Republican president to move off some of the pillars of his party's public philosophy that have lost support in the country and in the Congress, and that's a little less likely to happen. So we're going to live in this environment for a while. It's partisan, but parties aren't all bad, and we've had deeply partisan eras in the past, late 19th, early 20th century. This is a very difficult time in our politics, but what I want to leave you with is that we are a long, durable constitutional democracy. Constitution isn't perfect, but it's proven pretty adaptable. Things have gone wrong, badly wrong at times. We aren't perfect. We're not inherently better at democracy than other countries. Our greatest strength is our capacity for self-criticism and for self-correction and renewal. And I think we're in a period now where we've discovered what's gone wrong, and now we're beginning to roll up our sleeves and try to go to work on it. The first part is scoping out what has happened. The next part is doing something about it. We all have a role to play. It keeps American democracy vital. Thank you for having me here at your conference.